One of the things that I'm repeatedly asked about is end-time prophecy and thinking in terms of what the end will look like. And I frankly admit that as I look at Daniel and as I look at texts like Ezekiel and the book of the Apocalypse, that I find oftentimes I find myself more confused than I do understanding how to put it all together. But rather than really focusing on that issue, I want to say that, as I've said before, I may not know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that in and of itself should bring confidence and should bring hope. So I want to look just for a moment, and we'll come back to this core lesson in just a moment, but I want to look at places in the Hebrew Scripture really quick that where Yahweh is described as a man. Go with me to Genesis chapter 18. Genesis chapter 18. You can mark these in your Bible. This is where places where God is described, Yahweh is described as a man. In Genesis 18, verse 1, it says, "And Yahweh appeared to him," this is to Abram, "by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes," verse 2, "and behold, there 3 men. 3 men were standing in front of him." So here is the Hebrew word anashim, 3 men. We later find out at the opening to chapter 19 that 2 of these men are Malachim, and we find out at the end of chapter 18 that one of these is Yahweh. Okay? So verse 22 of Genesis 18, so the men turned from there and went toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham stood before Yahweh. Okay, so now we know that of these 3 men, 2 are Malachim and 1 is Yahweh, but they're called men. Go with me to Genesis chapter 32. Genesis chapter 32. Genesis chapter 32, we'll begin reading in verse 22. This is speaking of Jacob. This is speaking of Jacob. So somebody asks you, how do we know that God can be a man? Because isn't he spirit? But yet here's places where we're looking at where God can be a man and is described as a man. Genesis 32 verse 22 says, "The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched the hip of his socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint, and he wrestled with him. Then he said, 'Let me go, for the day has broken.' But Jacob said, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.' And he said to him, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'Yaakov.' Then he said, 'Your name shall no longer be called Yaakov, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed.'" And there's a man that Jacob wrestles with. Now go with me to Exodus chapter 15. Exodus chapter 15. We see this in our liturgy. Exodus chapter 15, verse 3. Exodus chapter 15, the Song of the Sea. It says this. Well, we'll go back to verse 2. We'll go back to verse 2. "The Lord Yahweh is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him." That's 15:2. And then it says in verse 3, "The Lord Yahweh is a man of war. Yahweh, his name. He's a man. Ish. Text describes him as Ish. Yahweh, Ish, Milchama. Yahweh is a man of war. Okay? Then, stepping outside the Torah, Joshua chapter 5. Joshua chapter 5 and verse 13. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. Same word, Ish, a man. So, we have a man that can stand in and stands for Yahweh. The Yahweh can be a man. And we've not even scratched the surface on this topic. But here's at least 4 texts coming to us saying that Yahweh can have and be described as a man. Now, I want to talk just a moment about this chariot throne that he rides. Go with me to Ezekiel chapter 1. In the prophets, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, most of your Bibles, Ezekiel. That's how they laid them out. Ezekiel chapter 1. And listen to this description. This is a description of the glory of the Lord, but it's really a description of what's called in Hebrew Merkavah. It comes from the Hebrew word rakab, which means to ride. But the chariot is called Merkavah. And in fact, today in Israel, they call the tanks in the IDF Merkavah chariots. And often the bus company in Israel is called Merkavah because they carry people. It carries people, and so it also uses the title Merkavah. Notice this description in verse 4. Ezekiel chapter 1. He says, I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and there was the appearance, they had a human likeness. Notice that. But each had 4 faces, each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings on the 4 sides they had human hands, and the 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another, each one of them went straight forward without turning as they went. As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side, the 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and the 4 had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. And their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wings of another, while 2 covered their bodies. And each went straight forward. Wherever the spirit or wind would go, they went, without turning as they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning, and the living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance as a flash of lightning. I'm going to continue reading. Listen to this. Now as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, and the 4 had the same likenesses, their appearance and construction being as it were a wheel within a wheel. When they went in any of their 4 directions without turning as they went. And the rims were tall and awesome, and the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all around. What's being described here? Amazing chariot, this huge chariot that God rides. Now, I want you to look with me then at 2 Kings. Go now back to 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 2. 2 Kings chapter 2, and look at verse 9. 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 9. We're going to see this chariot. It says, and when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you. And Elisha said, please let there be a double portion of your spirit on me. And he said, you have asked a hard thing, yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so. And as they still went on and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into the sky, and Elisha saw it and cried, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And he saw him no more. Okay? So we have these chariots of fire, the horsemen of Israel. Now go over with me to 2 Kings chapter 6. Just a few chapters over. 2 Kings chapter 6. And we pick it up in verse 15. 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 15. When the servant of the man of God arose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. And the servant said, alas, my master, what shall we do? He said, do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Then Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see. So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So the whole mountain is covered with chariots of fire and the horsemen of Israel. So we see that God has a chariot throne, a chariot with horses and fire. And we know that there's a man in that chariot because he's described, as I mentioned earlier, as a man. Now, go with me to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. And here again is this Merkabah imagery, this chariot imagery. Verse 9, Daniel having a vision. He says, I looked, verse 9, Daniel 7:9, I looked, thrones, notice the plural, were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne were fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. But notice, his throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. We have chariots of fire. Okay? Merkabah imagery of the throne of God. Are you following along with me? Okay? So here's what we have so far. We have a man. He's a man, described as a man, and he sits inside of a chariot, and he has a chariot army that is on fire, that has burning ones around it, and fire extends from this chariot. To continue that metaphor, we have some interesting text. Go with me to the book of Psalms. Psalm chapter 18. Psalm chapter 18. And we're going to pick up the reading in Psalm 18. We'll pick up the reading in verse 8. It says, well, I'm going to go back to verse 7. It says, the earth reeled and rocked, the foundations also of the mountains trembled and quaked because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. Okay, now that you get the imagery. Now skip over to verse 10. He rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, thick clouds dark with water. Out of the brightness before him, hailstones and coals of fire broke through his clouds. So he rides the clouds that are pushed along by the wind, and there are cherubim that are with him. Okay, in the imagery. Skip over to Psalm 104. Psalm 104. keeping us in the Psalms. Psalm 104, verse 3 and 4. It says this of Yahweh. Well, let's go back and just read the whole thing. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes his messengers winds, his ministers a flaming fire. Okay. And now I go to Psalm. Yeah, go ahead.
What psalm was that last one?
This one we're looking at now?
Yeah.
Psalm 104.
104. Okay, thank you.
Huh?
So I can see why because mine says his angel spirits.
Yeah, his ministers a flaming fire. Messengers, he makes his messengers winds.
So there, I can see the difference.
Yeah, messengers are angels. You can translate either way because the word angel means messenger.
I know that. I was just looking at the spirits part.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Angel spirits.
Yeah, so I can see why it's a little bit different there.
Yeah, and by the way, Psalm 103, notice Psalm 103 begins, Bless the Lord, O my soul. And Psalm 103 ends with, Bless the Lord, O my soul. And then Psalm 104 begins with, Bless the Lord, O my soul. And so Psalm 103 and 104 were meant to be read together as Psalm 104 also ends with, Bless the Lord, O my soul. So Psalms 103 and 104 are meant to be read in tandem. Okay, that's just for your consideration elsewhere. All right, Psalm 77. Go back to Psalm 77. Watch this imagery. The 77th Psalm, we're going to pick up our reading in verse 15. Psalm 77, verse 15. Actually, I'm going to go to verse 16 because it says this, When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water, the skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lifted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters. Yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Okay, so you hear your arrows flash on every side. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. You can see this imagery of the convulsing of the universe. So here's my point in all this. Okay, is to say this. I don't know what the future holds. I've said it this way. I'll tell you this much I know from reading the text. There's a man on a throne, a chariot throne, with an army behind him. He's got lightning and fire and cherubs. And I'm not worried. He rides the winds and he rides the clouds. He's ever present. And so whatever happens, it's okay.
As long as you're on his side.
I'm on his team. I get to be on his team. I want to be on that team. So I tend not to be apocalyptic because I look at it and say, A, I can't figure it all out. I mean, I can put pieces of it together. But I got to tell you, sometimes apocalyptic literature to me is like me handing you if I gave everybody in this room 2 pieces of a puzzle, but I didn't give you the box top. Yeah. You wouldn't have any idea how to piece those together. My family, I don't know about you guys, my family used to put together these 500 and 1,000 piece puzzles. Well, that's great because you dump it all out onto the table, but you have the box top that tells you where the different colors go. Okay, the yellows have to go over here in the left corner, the blues have to go over here in the right corner, and you start segmenting out the colors and go, okay, we got to piece these together. And I got to be honest with you, sometimes the biblical text, when we get to Daniel, Ezekiel, all these other texts in Revelation, I'm trying to figure out which part's the box top and how to piece it. So what I'm saying is this: For me, I'm looking at it going, you know what? I'll let other people write about all the apocalyptic stuff and how it's all going to play out. And if you listen to some apocalyptic teachers, they're so focused on what's happening in our world right now. They're trying to piece everything together with what's going on right now. Well, the danger of that is this: for the last 30 plus years, I've listened to them teach, and they say, well, Kissinger is the Antichrist. This Pope was the Antichrist. This particular person was the Antichrist. And I'm going, well, that person died. So if they were Antichrist, it really didn't work out well. And it didn't go and they try to shoehorn world events into the apocalyptic picture. And I'm much more comfortable saying this, and this is why I tend to be nonplussed by that approach, is that I know there's a man. This much I know. I know there's a man. I know he's on a throne. I know it's a fiery throne. I know he's got an army behind him. I know he's riding the wind and the waves. And he's in control of the universe. And everything will be okay. And I'm on his side. And whatever he wants to do, you know what? Just like the servant says, well, we're surrounded. It's chaotic. We're going to be destroyed. He says, look, open his eyes. We're surrounded by chariots of fire. It's going to all be okay. God has an army that's massive, that is stealth, that is on fire, and they can destroy anybody that gets in their way. So nothing will happen to his people that he doesn't want to happen. And I'm okay with leaving it there. Yeah.
So what do you do with John 4:24 that says God is a spirit, and those who worship in spirit and truth?
He is a spirit. I'm not denying he's spirit, but I'm also saying he's man.
Okay.
Yes.
He's a man. He's both. The text calls him a man. And by the way, this is why a couple of weeks back, and I've been going through this repeatedly, is if you wanted to make sure that you never thought of God as a human being, that he could never take on flesh, why would you have these texts that say he's a man? Not only that, but as I pointed out a couple weeks ago, we have God with all these body parts. He's got hands, he's got eyes, he's got feet, he's got palms, he's got a voice, he's got all these different body parts that relate to humanity. If I want to make sure that God was just spirit and could never be body, could never incarnate in flesh, I certainly would never have called him a man, and I certainly would never have given him body parts. I would have stayed studiously away from those, because it smacks of his being able to partake of humanity. But yet the text is repeatedly saying, he's the eyes of the Lord, the hand of the Lord, the arm of the Lord, the feet of the Lord, the voice of the Lord, his ears, his nose, that the blast of his nostrils, the waters go back with regard to the Red Sea. Why even use that imagery? I'd stay away from that. I mean, even if you get too close to that, you say things like, the Lord can see what's going on. The Lord hears. You think, well, okay, how does he hear? How does he see? Well, it's because he's got eyes and he's got ears. Just like you and I do. So, the fact that he rides the clouds, the fact that he has a chariot, and the fact that he is a man tells me everything is okay. We're okay. Yeah.
It's kind of weird for me is that what part you read about Jacob sending his wife and everybody over to and then all of a sudden he just happens to stay there. He just happens to wrestle with this guy. Now the thing that's weird for me is if that's God, well, it's God. But how come Jacob's winning? I mean, that's the thing that's kind of weirding me out. And why would he want to fight? And how did Jacob know he had to fight with the guy?
I'll tell you why he wins. And by the way, his name is changed to Israel,
right,
which has the idea of wrestling with God. Israel means wrestling with God. I think that the only way it works is this. I'll tell you how it works. It's just like my father used to wrestle with me. And he'd let me win. But not because I was stronger than him. Because he let me win. In other words, it can happen like that, in the sense that it doesn't have to be, the condensation of God. Yeah.
How did he win? He dislocated his hip.
Well, I
That's
mean,
a loss.
Right, that's a loss. I know. I'm just saying.
I mean,
Well,
but I'm saying
yeah,
in the
I
wrestling,
see
in the process of the
We
wrestling,
wouldn't let him go.
he wouldn't let him go.
Right.
And of course, I think at this point, look, if he doesn't want to be caught, he's not. It's like my father. If I pin him, it's only because he lets me. When we were kids, he'd wrestle with us. Okay, well, sometimes I'd say, pin you, he'd go, yeah, okay, but
Rachel, I mean, but Jacob wasn't a kid, he was an older man.
I know, but I'm saying he's wrestling with God. So
he's
if God doesn't want to be
he's a
pinned,
kid.
God doesn't want to be held, he lets him. This is the incarnation. This is the incarnation that God puts himself into humanity, which is a box. It has its limitations. You get tired, you get sleepy, you get hungry. Okay, you have your limitations on the human side.
So God just happened to be there that day and
No, God sought him out. God was seeking him out.
Okay.
No, this is intentional.
It's a plan thing.
It's planned. It's a planned wrestling match.
Okay.
It's very intentional.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to say to that point, I don't know when it was, about maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Barbra Streisand did a concert at like a little bar in Manhattan, right, where she used to be when she was a kid. And the paper was writing about it, and they said, and the crowd would not let her go. They just kept clapping and she'd do another song. And then they kept clapping and she'd do another song. It wasn't necessarily like it physically restrained her, but by just sheer will, they just, come on, don't leave yet. You know what I mean? And so she wouldn't go. Maybe it's in that vein.
Okay.
Why would he have to break the hip or dislocate?
But yeah, in this instance, he touches the socket of his hip, and from this point forward, Jacob walked with a limp.
Just to make sure he knows.
So I think he's just saying, look, by the way, I think this is his way of saying, look, if I wanted to mess with you,
Right.
I could really have messed with you. And you're never going to be the same after I touch you.
Okay.
In other words, if you think you can hold me, no, you can't hold me.
Well, the term is prevail. He prevailed. It doesn't-
Right.
I don't think it means who knows what he prevailed over. Obviously he didn't prevail over God,
No.
but he may have prevailed over something he was struggling with. And you put it in context, and where was he going? He was going to meet up with his brother Esau, who he was afraid of.
Yeah.
And it was after that wrestling match that they were able to reconcile. And so I think a lot of it is that he may have prevailed over himself in terms of his self-centeredness, his...
That's true.
You know what I mean? And so, I'd have to read the Hebrew to see what
Yeah.
word they use for prevail,
Yeah.
but it's like... if you look in context for it, he's a changed man after
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, he is.
And it's not because he's just limping. Anybody can limp. I can limp. But, it's a matter of, he had a huge job to do, and he needed to do it God's way.
It was weird because there was usually not a whole lot of build up, and just sort of, oh, by the way, and then he wrestled with this guy, and,